All right, continuing on. This is the sixth week we're doing this. Looking at the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Kind of again, a rather humorous story, lots of humorous elements to this story. Dealing with Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. Again, the handouts in the back if you want one to follow along with. So again, as always, start by reading the text here. Not almost the entire chapter. There's a little bit of the end of the chapter of 18 here that we're not including, but most of the chapter we'll look at. So after considerable time had passed, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, "Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." So Elijah went off to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. And now it so happened that Obadiah greatly feared the Lord. So when Jezebel was destroying the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them, 50 to a cave, and provided them with bread and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the streams. Perhaps we will find grass and can keep the horses and mules alive and will not have to destroy any of the cattle." So they divided the land between them to scour it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went the other way by himself. While Obadiah was on the way, what should he happen to see but Elijah coming to meet him? He recognized him and fell on his face and asked, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" And he replied to him, "Yes, it is I. Go, say to your Lord, behold, Elijah." But he asked, "What have I done wrong that you're handing me over to Ahab to be put to death? As the Lord your God lives, there's not a nation or kingdom to which my Lord has not sent someone to look for you. And if they say he is not here, then he makes that kingdom or nation swear that it could not find you. And now you are saying, go say to your Lord, behold Elijah. It may happen that when I leave you, the Spirit of the Lord may carry you I know not where. And if I go and tell Ahab, and he does not find you, he will kill me. And yet your servant has feared the Lord from my youth. Has it not been reported to my Lord what I did when Jezebel was murdering the prophets of the Lord, that I hid 100 of the prophets of the Lord, 50 in one cave and 50 in another, and provided them with bread and water? And now you are saying, go say to your Lord, behold Elijah, but he will kill me. But Elijah replied, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will most certainly present myself to him today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. Then Ahab said to Elijah, or now when Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" Excuse me, Elijah replied. "I'm not the one who has made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's house have, by abandoning the commandments of the Lord and walking after the Baals. Now then, summon all Israel and have them meet me at Mount Carmel. And while you're at it, be sure to bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab summoned all the sons of Israel, and he gathered the prophets on Mount Carmel. Then Elijah drew near to all the people and said, "How long will you continue limping along on two crutches? If the Lord is the God, walk after him. But if it's Baal, walk after him." But the people did not say a word in reply. So Elijah said to the people, "I myself am the only prophet of the Lord that remains, but the prophets of Baal number 450 men. Now let 2 young bulls be brought for us, and let them select 1 young bull for themselves, and cut it into pieces and set it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then I myself will prepare the other young bull, and will put it on the wood, but will not set fire to it. Then you will call in the name of your God, and I myself will call in the name of the Lord. And whichever God answers by fire, he is the God." Then all the people responded and said, "Sounds good to us." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Select the first bull for yourselves and prepare it first, because there are so many of you. Then call in the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the young bull which was given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one who answered. And they limped around the altar they had made. Now at noon, Elijah began to mock them and said, "You need to shout louder to get his attention," because obviously he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought. Perhaps he had to use a little boy's room. Perhaps he's taking a trip. Wait, I know what it is. He's taking a nap and needs to be woken up. So they shouted louder, and they cut themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood was pouring out all over them. So it was that midday passed, and they continued their raving until the time when the evening sacrifice was offered. But there was no voice, and no one who answered, and no one who paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Draw near to me." So all the people drew near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been demolished. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel will be your name." And with the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Then he arranged the pieces of wood and cut the young bull into pieces and set them on the pieces of wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it out over the burnt offering and over the pieces of wood." Then he said, "Do it again." So they did it again. Then he said, "Do it a third time." So they did it a third time. As a result, the water flowed down around the altar, and the water also filled up the trench. So it was that when the evening sacrifice was being offered, Elijah the prophet drew near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I myself am your servant, and that according to your words I have done all these things. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are the God, and that you yourself have turned their hearts back again." And the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dirt, and the water that was in the trench, it also licked up. When all the people saw this, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God." Then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of the Baal. Do not let don't let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Kishon brook, and he slaughtered them there. All right, so there's the story. Again, a lot of humorous elements, which we'll touch on as we go through this. Again, starting off, context. What's the context for this? Again, we're kind of starting in some ways midstream here. We pick up what's come before. What's the context of this story?
3-year drought.
Okay, so we've had a 3-year drought. Okay, right. So that's sort of the immediate context, right? Is we've had this 3-year drought. All right. So stepping back a little bit, who's kind of mentioned there? Who's king? Ahab. What do we know about Ahab? He was really bad, right? In fact, according to 1 Kings 16, he's the worst one yet. Okay, he's the worst king that Israel has yet seen. Now, this is the period of the divided kingdom. This is probably about 60 or 70 years after the kingdom divided, after the death of Solomon and the division of the kingdom. So the division kingdom hasn't been around super long, but there have been a few kings before him, and thus far Ahab is the worst they've had. One of his main crimes, one of the significant crimes, was the introduction of Baal worship into Israel. Right. Before this, they had Jeroboam had built the golden calves. What he had done that was still supposedly worship of the Lord, but it was a distorted version of it. It was a messed up version, but still, it was still supposed to be the Lord that they were worshiping, even though they're doing it incorrectly and inappropriately. But with Ahab, we have a totally new rival deity brought into Israel with the introduction of Baal worship. And mostly, this is due to his wife. Jezebel was a princess of Phoenicia, of Sidon, where they worshipped Baal. And so that's where it's coming from. It's not really, we'll talk about this a little bit more later. It's probably not that Ahab's like a big Baal person to bring this in. It's that his wife is. His wife is kind of this zealous Baal worshiper. So she kind of brings it in, and Ahab's kind of a pushover, and he just kind of lets her do whatever she wants. Okay? But as a result of Jezebel marrying him, coming into Israel, we had the introduction of Baal worship, which is, again, the context of the story, because that's who Elijah is up against. And then we had this 3-year drought. Okay. What's significant about a drought? Why did God punish the people with a drought?
They depended on the
Okay, yeah, water, right. So obviously a drought is very bad. I mean, it's a dry area to begin with, and if you don't have any water, it's even that much worse. But why a drought as opposed to some other form of punishment? Okay, in what way? Okay, sure. All right. So certainly it's reflective of the relationship with God, that they have this dead, dry, dead relationship with God. Um, okay, so it's a covenant punishment, right? So there's a sense, if you look back at Deuteronomy, that if you break the covenant, there are lots of different curses that could come on you, and things like drought, famine were one of those. But specifically, there's a specific significance. Who's Baal?
The god of rain,
Right, he's a storm god. He's a fertility god. And so he's a god who's supposed to be able to send rain and send crops. So if you have a drought on the land, what does it say about Baal? Can't do jack squat, right? He's not doing anything, right? So this is a punishment. You think that by going after Baal, you're going to get your rain and your fertility. I'm going to demonstrate to you that that's not going to work, right? I'm going to send a drought to demonstrate pursuing Baal isn't going to give you what you think you're going to get. So it's a direct punishment because of the kind of God that they've tried to turn to instead. And so coming into this, again, sort of in the context, right? Before this, Elijah has proclaimed the 3-year drought. He goes and he's by this brook and he's fed by ravens for a while, and then the stream dries up and God sends him to basically Jezebel's homeland, right, into Phoenicia. He doesn't, Jesus makes this point. He doesn't go to a Israelite widow. He goes to a Sidonian, a Phoenician widow, and stays with her for a while. And there's just sort of this miracle where her food just keeps going, right? He finds her. She's going to make one more meal and die. But there's this miracle where the food just keeps coming. He stays with her all this time. So he's been up in Phoenicia during the drought, and now he reappears in Israel. And so you get this irony. He's been in basically the territory where Baal worship has come from, but now he's come back to Israel. It's come back to God has said, I'm going to finally send rain on the land. There's going to be sort of this object lesson first, but I'm going to finally send rain after these 3 years. So he comes to Obadiah. He finds Obadiah, who's the servant of Ahab, and he asks for an audience. Again, you'll see, as we've kind of mentioned in some of the other stories we've looked at, there's this aspect of the threefold repetition. Again, numbers were kind of significant, and especially when you see the 3, because again, back in that day, largely an auditory society, an oral society, they didn't have bold-faced font that you could read. They didn't have underlines. So the way that you emphasize things is you repeated them, right? So this threefold repetition is always this idea of emphasis, right? So 3 times in that conversation, twice by Obadiah, once by Elijah, there's this repetition of his request to see Ahab. And so there's this emphasis on, right? And the translation I've given you is the literal Hebrew. It's just very simple. Behold Elijah, right? A lot of your translations will say, hey, look, Elijah's here, or see Elijah's here, or whatever. But it's literally just behold Elijah. And it's kind of like, look, right? Calling attention. You got to pay attention to Elijah here, right? Calling to Ahab to take notice of Elijah's return and of what Elijah wants, what he's going to do. But Obadiah isn't too keen on the request, right? His response is, you want me to do what exactly? You realize that you're just sending me to my death. I go tell him, right? Mainly he's concerned that again, his concern is, I'm going to tell him you're not there. He's going to kill me because Elijah's a one man, right? He says, Ahab's been searching all over the place for you. He's even going to other kingdoms, demanding an accounting, making sure they have them search. They have to make sure, they have to swear, sign in blood that they can't find you. Right? He knows that Ahab wants Elijah very badly. Again, he's concerned that if he tells Ahab, hey, Elijah's over here, and Elijah isn't there, he's a dead man. So he's not particularly keen on doing this, although Elijah gives him encouragement. I'll be there. Don't worry. Just go tell him. I'll show up. Don't worry. But just as a little aside, in sort of this this prologue to the story, there's a little bit in the midst of all this. There's a little bit of encouragement as to the presence of Obadiah, because things are really bad. We read the story. The people are kind of waffling. Kind of the sense of just how bad things are. That it's pagan and paganism and Baal worship. But there's a little bit of encouragement as you read this. There's a little bit of encouragement that in spite of the bad situation in Israel, you still have a man like Obadiah wandering around. He works for Ahab, right? This wicked king, but you have a God-fearing man who works for him, who's still in there, that God has put in that place, who's still able to do things, right? And he's in a position where he's able to actually protect some of the prophets who are getting killed because of his position in the palace. He has the resources, he has the ability to act and protect some of those prophets while Jezebel is killing them. So there's some, in the midst of all of that, there's some encouragement that God in his sovereignty, even in the wickedest times, still preserves his people, still puts his people in particular positions where they can act, where they can do his will, and can in some measure oppose the evil that's going on around them. God never sort of completely, at least yet, completely abandons anything to its wickedness. There's still some element of his ability to work even in those very dire situations. And you have to give Obadiah some credit. I mean, he was willing to act, right? He saw what was going on, and he's willing to do something about it, right? Obviously, that he's putting his own neck on the line by saving people who Jezebel's killing. So you see that, again, encouragement that God, even in bad times, God is still at work. God still puts people in places he wants them to be that can do his work and continue to do righteous things even in the midst of evil times. So then, Ahab goes to, Obadiah tells Ahab goes to meet Elijah. And when he sees Elijah, he says to him, right, is that you, troubler of Israel? This, if you read First Chronicles, this is the same designation that's given to Achan. He's called a troubler of Israel. Who is Achan? Right. After the fall of Jericho, back in the beginning of Joshua, the fall of Jericho, God says, leave everything alone. Everything is devoted to me. Don't touch anything. And Achan didn't listen. He thought it'd be fun. He saw some nice stuff. He thought, yeah, I can take that. That's fine. And what happened to Israel as a result? Right. They fought Ai. They thought this would be a piece of cake. They lost. People were killed. Afterwards, Joshua was in this big panic. Right. It brought trouble on Israel. Right. That his disobedience brought trouble on Israel, and they ended up suffering for it. What happened to Achan? Got stoned. Right. Not anything good. So this is the designation that Ahab is giving to Elijah. He's saying, you've brought trouble on Israel, right? And he's basically blaming him for the one who's brought the drought, the one who's brought the disaster on the people. He's basically saying that Elijah is public enemy number one. And in acquitting with Achan, he's basically charging him with crimes against the state, right? That you deserve to die just like Achan died. Right? That he is, in equating Elijah with Achan, he's equating him with similar sort of crimes and suggesting he deserves a similar sort of outcome. And again, this is why he's been searching everywhere for him, right? Is because he's blaming him and in some way or another, he wants to bring this drought to end. Maybe he thinks if he kills him, that'll bring a drought to end. Maybe if he thinks maybe he can force him into doing something. But he blames Elijah for the drought, and he blames him for their trouble. But Elijah then turns this right around on him. Okay. Now, the excuse me part is my own little flair. That's not in the Hebrew, in case you're wondering. But I can sort of see him responding that way, right? That's kind of what that kind of implied in the text is that you got this all wrong, buddy. Right? Elijah turns the charge. Ahab blames him with being the troublemaker. Elijah turns this right back around on him and says, "I'm not. If you want to look at who the troublemaker is, you're pointing the finger in the wrong direction, right? The person who's causing you looking. If you want to see who's creating the problems for Israel, you need to look in the mirror. It's not me. It's you, right? Because of the covenant unfaithfulness, because of turning away from the Lord to follow Baal, to follow these other gods, right? He has brought the trouble. The reason there's the drought is because you decided to follow this other god that you thought would bring rain and fertility to the land. So there's a drought to punish you for it. So in essence, again, the one who's committed the crimes worthy of death isn't Elijah, but it's Ahab, right? In turning the people away from the Lord, he's the one who really is worthy of death. So here's the setup, right? That right, the kind of exchanging barbs, and and you get this kind of very human, sort of not unlike a little bit what was talked about this morning in the sermon. This propensity to blame other people for our own mistakes, right? Ahab is the one who's failed here. He's the one who's turned to other gods. He's the one who's the cause of the drought, and yet he's blaming Elijah for it. Right? It's always a lot easier as human beings to point fingers at other people than it is to take responsibility. Right? But again, Ahab's blaming Elijah. Elijah turns this around on him, and that sets it up for what he's going to do. Right? You're the one to blame. But now we're going to set up this situation that will kind of bring all this to a head to show who's really who and what's going on here. Right. So there's just kind of two questions, right? Because then Elijah gives Ahab these instructions, says, I want you to gather all the people on Mount Carmel. I want you to bring the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Asherah, to bring everybody there. We're going to have this contest. But as I read this passage, there are two questions that kind of pop into my mind. The first of all, if Elijah's public enemy number one, and Ahab's going to meet him, you notice Ahab doesn't seem to bring anybody with him. He seems to show up by himself. He doesn't bring an army. He doesn't bring the local police. He doesn't bring anybody. If he's public enemy number one, but he doesn't bring anybody along to arrest him. Which is just kind of fascinating. If he wanted him dead, if he wanted him to force him into some changing the situation, you'd think that he would have brought the required force to do that, and he doesn't. The other thing I find interesting is Ahab gives Elijah these instructions, or Elijah gives Ahab these instructions, says, gather the people, bring the prophets, and that's exactly what Ahab does, right? You don't read any conflict. He doesn't say, why should I do that? He doesn't give any response. He just does it. I think is also fascinating. He's the king. He doesn't say, well, I'm the one who gives orders. He just does what Elijah says, which I think is fascinating. I think there are a few reasons for this. First of all, is if you read through the First Kings and the story of Ahab, he strikes me as kind of being a spineless pushover. He's just not a real tough guy. That he kind of seems to be easily manipulated. Like, I think, again, his wife, Jezebel, is the stronger personality. So that's why Baal worship is in the land. Not because Ahab really cares, but because it's a Jezebel's thing. If you read later on in the story of Naboth's vineyard, right, he's kind of just throwing this, he's kind of out in, he can't get the vineyard he wants. He goes home and lies on his bed and throwing a fit. Jezebel's coming in like, what are you doing? You're the king. Act like the king. And he, so there's a sense in which you get the sense that he's just not a real strong personality. He's easily manipulated by stronger personalities around him. And it seems that Elijah apparently had a more forceful personality, which was able to sway him. There's also some possibility that Ahab's had some, in spite of his potential animosity towards Elijah, especially because of the drought, there's still some potential, some reverence for, or some recognition of the authority of the prophet of the Lord, that within the kingdom of Israel, the Lord's prophets did have some degree of authority. Now, depending on the king as to how much they may have weighed that. But there's still some sense in which, again, Israel isn't entirely gone over to Baal worship. There's still some idea of maybe trying to use some sort of syncretistic practice where they're trying to worship both gods at the same time. And so there still may have been some sense of reverence that Ahab had for the authority of a prophet of the Lord. When a prophet tells him to do something, he does it. Although if you look later on at the end of his life, he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of respect for Micaiah. So it's possible this isn't the case. Although again, he may have, this was a little bit earlier. Later on, his attitude may have changed more. And again, some of it may have just been Elijah's personality. That it just may be that Elijah was a stronger personality, was able to kind of motivate Ahab into action more than other people. But they're just fascinating questions. You read the story, at least for me, they're just kind of why it's things you don't expect, right? If you think you kind of follow along with the story, and you just kind of wonder why is it going this way?
Yeah, and Andy, along those lines, as I think about Ahab and I think about Jezebel, in some ways, like it says in the New Testament, when we pursue sin or evil, God gives us over to a reprobate mind.
Yeah.
Jezebel was like evil to the core.
Yeah.
And we see that in her ending. But then as you look at Numbers 21:29, when it says, seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbled himself before me, I will not bring evil in his days.
Right.
God was merciful to Ahab, and it makes me wonder whether that's because there's like you were saying, that reverence for the things of God may still exist, or there's a humility within him that still is sensitive to perhaps the truth at that point. I don't know.
Right. I think, right. If you look at the story of Naboth's vineyard, again, Jezebel is kind of the really wicked one there. Ahab, I'm not sure how much Ahab really knew what was going on. He's like, oh, I got the vineyard. Great. And then I think you're right. I think there's still some sense that he had some understanding of consequences and was willing to humble himself. Obviously, he still wasn't a great guy, but obviously he got to the point where again, to use the New Testament idea, his conscience wasn't entirely seared. It wasn't entirely gone. There's still some at least there some sense of conscientiousness about what he had done and its consequences. Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking that the context of the drought probably played a lot into this too. I mean, Ahab is king over a country that's dying, and he's desperate for it to rain. So if God exists at all, maybe I should listen to his prophet to bring the rain.
Okay, true. Yeah, sure. If Elijah's proposing something that might allow it to rain again, then it absolutely he might be willing to concede that. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe an act of desperation. Absolutely. Yeah. Just again, some interesting questions as you read through the story. But yes, those are good ideas as well. Absolutely. But for a reason, he decides to do it. And so what Elijah proposes is this head-to-head showdown between the gods. Right? We've got these two competing deities that Israel now is worshiping. And so he says, let's see who's real. Which one is really the God? So he sets up this competition between the two. So first of all, again, we have this assembling of what I would call the contestants. So we have Elijah, who represents the Lord, Israel's true God. We have the prophets of Baal and Asherah, who are sort of the representatives of, if I may call them, the pagan challenger, right? The newbie into the land who has been brought in to rival Israel's true God. And then we have the people who are kind of the audience, right? So whenever you have a competition, it's good to have an audience along there to watch. But these are really the people whom it's targeted, right? These are the people who need to see what's really what and who is really who. So we have this assembling of the contestants, right? So we have Elijah, we have the prophets of Baal, and we have the people who are there to watch to see what's really what. Okay, and so Elijah steps up and has a sort of preamble, right? When everything's assembled, he has a sort of preamble to the competition, right? He sets things up and he has this conversation with the people. And he begins in setting up the competition by confronting the people with their own fickleness, by their own wishy-washiness, right? That they've kind of got these two gods in there, and the literal term that he uses there is you're limping along, kind of limping back and forth between them. You're hobbling along on two crutches. This idea of a lot of times, a lot of your translations have the idea of wavering between two opinions, I think is one translation mentions it. But this idea of it being indecisive, the trying to appease both gods at the same time, again, trying to follow some sort of syncretistic practice where, I can please Israel's God, please Baal, that you gotta, hedge my bet and try to please everybody in the hopes that one of them will do what I want. Very common in pagan cultures that you just kind of all these different gods, the different things, you try to appease all of them in some way or other. But the result is that spiritually speaking, they're merely limping, right? It's the idea of being infirm, being weak, an inadequate situation. This is not a healthy spiritual situation to be in, trying to please two gods at the same time. Right? This kind of limping along, trying to sort of prop themselves up with the crutches, prop themselves up with two religious systems that don't really work together. Not only is it on crutches, but they're like in crutches that aren't the same height. So you're kind of like, right, these systems that don't really sync together. And so it leads to this very awkward sort of situation. And so he tells them, stop limping along, make a choice, pick somebody, either pick God or pick Baal, but just pick somebody and follow him. And it's interesting, again, that the term that he uses, and again, it's got the word has some nuance, so you can translate different ways. But it's interesting, he sets this contrast, instead of limping, walk. Either walk after the Lord or walk after Baal, but just walk. Stop limping, choose a side, and walk. Right? Stop this sort of limping about and kind of walk with resolution, walk with firmness in some direction. Pick one and follow it. Right? But he's saying you can't, the syncretistic worship you're trying to do isn't going to cut it. You can't do both at the same time. The worship, especially, maybe you can worship from a Baalistic perspective, you might be able to worship the Lord too, but certainly from the perspective of the Lord, Baal isn't going to cut. You can't do Baal and me at the same time. You can't worship both of these gods and do so effectively and have it work for you. And in the midst of it, you'll notice, again, I mentioned this kind of before, it's good to pay attention to the names that the author uses for God. Here again, Elijah confronts people with God's covenant name. He says, if the Lord is God, walk after him. Right? Again, we've talked about this in some of the previous sessions, that this is God's covenant name. This is the name that he used to reveal himself to Israel, to Moses, right? And so just the sound of that name should tell them right off who's their God, right? They should hear that and say, oh yes, of course, that's the God who brought us out of Egypt. That's the God of the Exodus, right? They shouldn't need the following competition. The name alone should remind them of who their God is and what he has done for them. Right? This is the God who brought you out of Egypt, remember? We shouldn't need a competition to see who really is your God. Your God's already redeemed you out of the land of slavery. You shouldn't need any other gods. You shouldn't need to be reminded of which God to follow. So there's some sense in using that name, which should already be creating some guilt and some, in the hearts of the people, it should making them sit up and pay attention and give thought to what actually is going on here. So how do the people respond? Elijah confronts them with their situation. You're limping around. You're trying to follow two gods at the same time. It's not working. And how do the people respond? Yeah. Silence. Right? They say nothing. Part of this is probably guilt, right? That they recognize that he's probably accurate in his assessments. So there's some shame, some guilt going on there. Some of this is, I think, it's maybe a little bit of irony. These are people who are wishy-washy. They're waffling between the gods, so they still don't want to commit themselves, right? These are people who are kind of religiously not really interested in commitment, so they don't really commit themselves here either. They haven't committed themselves to a god yet, and they're still not ready. And so they don't say anything because they don't want to commit themselves. But for whatever reason, right, they're silent. They don't say anything to his challenge to them in their religious condition. So Elijah proposes this competition. He sets up the rules for how this competition is going to work. Right? So we have two sides. We have the Lord's side, we have Baal's side. Each side gets to prepare an offering, but don't set fire to it. Right? Just leave it alone. You're supposed to call the name of your God, and he's supposed to do something. And so whichever side's God actually answers by fire is the big winner of the competition. And the presumption here is that only one side is going to answer. I don't know what would happen. Obviously, this couldn't happen, but I don't know what would have happened if it had been a tie. Obviously, that wasn't an issue, but obviously, this is presuming that only one of these gods is real to begin with. Right? Now, from a pagan perspective, there were multiple gods. So from a pagan perspective, there theoretically could have been a tie. Now we know better, and Elijah's proposing this competition because he knows what's going to happen. But from if you're the prophets of Baal, maybe there could have been a tie or something. But what's interesting is that Elijah creates a situation where the deities have to act, right? It's not just, faith is a great thing, but it can also be misused, and it's very easy, if it's just faith, it's easy, to believe in whatever, right? We've got lots of belief systems in our world, right? And there are people who would argue that it's just, it's just as legitimate to believe in Allah as to believe in our God, or to believe in the, Hindu gods or whatever. And so Elijah basically sets up a system, a competition, where the belief in your God isn't quite enough, right? Because the prophets of Baal could argue, we believe in our God just as strongly as you believe in yours or whatever. He sets up a situation where I'm going to make your deity act, right? If he's there, he's got to actually do something, right? Just believing in whatever isn't going to cut it here. I want your God to prove that he exists and that he can actually do something. So he knows his God is real and can act. Now he wants to demonstrate to the people whether or not the pagan challenger, has the same capability.
But the fact that they agreed to do that showed that they really did have faith in their
absolutely.
Their God.
Yeah, the fact that they agreed to this competition shows that they definitely believe that their God is perfectly capable of doing it.
It also shows that Satan has a lot of power, and they don't know who is acting, but obviously they've done some amazing things in the past to agree to this.
Right. Or certainly their belief, that their God is capable. Again, if you look at the Muslim world, I don't know many Muslims have necessarily seen Allah act, but they certainly believe he is capable of it. And so absolutely, they are very much, they're not going to agree to this unless they're perfectly confident that they will get a response from Baal. Absolutely. And so again, the winner is going to be something obvious. Any limping about religiously, spiritually by the people should be brought to an end. It's going to be perfectly clear who's the winner. This is also a winner-take-all situation, as we find out at the end. Okay, this is not a competition for the faint of heart. You lose, it's bad news for you. Now all the people speak up. Right, so here's my more modern translation of their response. Right, they're like, "Sweet, entertainment. This is going to be great. We get to watch the gods do stuff. So the audience is approves. Right? They're interested in seeing how this will work. They're good with this suggestion. So they're quiet before. They didn't say anything before, but now they speak up and like, yay, we're in favor of this. Which is kind of interesting. Now they find their voice. And so we have this contest that's then set up, right, which Elijah's proposed. So we have these two contestants, all right? These two contestants. So kind of like if it was some sort of WWE sort of match here. Not that I watch that because I don't. But you just kind of see that this competition set up here that over in this corner, hailing from Sidon and weighing in at 450 prophets, the Canaanite storm god Baal. All right, there's in one corner, and in the other corner, hailing from right here in Israel and weighing in at only one single solitary prophet, the Lord. And Elijah, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but Elijah makes that point, right? I'm alone. He's got 450 guys in his corner, right? It's 1 versus 450 in this competition. So those are the contestants. And if you read through the passage, there's a very interesting situation that's set up. Elijah stacks the deck in his opponent's favor. He doesn't stack the deck in his favor. He does about everything he can possibly to make all the advantages in the favor of the Baal prophets. So again, one of the issues is that there are 450 prophets, and that's not including the other 400 prophets of Asherah, right? So you put them in, there's 850 prophets versus 1. So in a sheer numbers game, if it's all about numbers, Elijah is in huge trouble. Right? If number of prophets equals the likelihood your God is going to act, then we got a serious problem here, right? Because Baal's got a whole lot of them. The location that Elijah picks is actually beneficial to Baal. The Mount Carmel, in its location, it's a high ridge. It's near the Mediterranean. It would probably not be as affected by the drought as a lot of the rest of the land. It would seem to be less influence. The power of sort of Baal to nurture life would have been stronger there. It's possible this is also a lot closer. Definitely is a lot closer to Phoenicia, more close to his home territory. So he's choosing a location that sort of, again, should give an advantage to Baal. That it's the spot should play out to play to Baal's advantage here, as someplace he should be able to act more easily. Again, close to his own turf. Right? He proposes a test that a storm god like Baal should be able to pass easily. Right? A god who answers by fire. Now, this fire may have been lightning. Right? So they would have considered lightning to be kind of a fire thing. And so for a storm god, sending lightning should be a piece of cake. Right? So this is a test, right? As opposed to some other test like, parting the water or something. If he's not a water god, that may have been a more difficult thing. But storm god, sending lightning should be easy. Right? So he proposes a test that Baal should be able to pass without difficulty. And then he gives his opponents first crack. So he gives them the choice of the first bull, which means they get to pick the better offering. So there are 2 bulls brought, right? They're probably close to being about the same, but they're probably not equal. So you get the first choice. You can pick the better one. Better bull, better appeasement. You're more likely to please your God if you've got the better sacrifice. Right? So they get first bull. Okay. They get to choose the more appealing sacrifice. He also gives them first shot at appealing to their God. Right? So if Baal responds, Elijah's basically hosed. Right? The God who answers by fire is the winner. If Baal responds first, basically the competition's over. He just had a God respond. That's game over is essentially the possibility there. This is like in NFL overtime. If you get the ball first and you score a touchdown, the game is over. Your opponent doesn't get a shot. That may be the situation here where if Baal answers, it's game over and Elijah's toast. So by giving them first crack, he's giving them first advantage, giving the first chance to show that their God is real, giving them the chance to win the competition straight off. And then he does this crazy thing where he takes literally bucketfuls of water and pours them all over his altar, right? So it's not, you can't even have like a random chance occurrence of a spark, somebody out there smoking, a spark catching fire and letting your art, oh, look, my altar's on fire, right? I mean, he even, makes it harder for his God to do this because his altar is soaking wet now. He does everything he can to make things difficult for himself and to give Baal every advantage and his prophets every advantage. So if it's about ease, Baal should be able to do this. But what this also does is if Baal fails, it will be that much more humiliating for him and his prophets. Right? If they had every advantage in their favor and they still can't pull this off, that speaks to the absolute non-existent worthlessness of Baal. That this God that Israel has kind of capitulated to, he's been given every advantage and he still can't make it happen. Right? That speaks to his worthlessness, his inadequacy in that case. Right? So it's a danger, theoretically. He's not afraid. He wouldn't give them all these advantages. He's not afraid. But there's the danger of giving them advantages that they could win. But the flip side of that is if you have all these advantages and you don't win, it's that much more humiliating for you. And that's what he's trying to set up here for Baal and his prophets. So, again, the prophets of Baal get to start things off. So they prepare their sacrifice, and they put it on the wood. And they get to spend all morning calling on their God. Okay. I don't know if they did this in there are 450 of them. I don't know if they did this in relays or stuff, because you'd think by after doing that all morning, you wouldn't have a voice left. So I don't know if they kind of switched on and off so they give their voices a rest or something, but they do this all morning long. Okay. And what's the result? Yep. Nothing. Silence. All right. They get a whole bunch of nothing in response to all of their pleading and walking around, limping around their altar. They get nothing. A lot of work, a lot of nothing in return. And so, all right. So again, no voice, no one answered. And so after doing this all morning, around noon, Elijah starts to speak up, right? And he starts to give him some flack. Right? He starts giving him grief. He has some fun at their expense. Again, he set up this whole competition in their advantage, and nothing's happening. Right? So he's making fun of the prophets. He's making fun of their God. His mockery helps to highlight the futility of their actions and the worthlessness of their God. By making fun of him, he's not doing anything, guys. He's supposed to be a God, right? Why isn't he doing anything? It just kind of that much more highlights just how useless their activity is, how worthless their God is. Right? And so he's again, in his mockery, we'll go over this more in a moment, but in his mockery, he's highlighting just how inferior Baal is to God, right? to the true God, to Israel's God. And again, that should be in the mockery. This is also, again, the people are there watching this and should be listening to this. And so in doing this, he's trying to teach the people, this is the other God that you're thinking is worth following, right? He's pointing out to the people just how stupid that idolatry on their part is, because this God isn't worth it. He isn't doing jack, right? And so he goes through and he has some fun. So deep in thought, right? So Baal's busy thinking. So, it's tough. He's basically got a lot on his mind. He's deep in thought. It's hard to be a god. He's got a lot on his mind. I bet he's deep in thought. That's why he's not paying attention. The implication of that is that he can only focus on one thing at a time, which means he's not omniscient. Right? He can only focus on one task at a time. He's too busy thinking about something else to pay attention to you. He's having to use the restroom. That's. I think the Hebrew literally says he's having a bowel movement. Basically, he's implying that he's had a call of nature. He has to use the restroom, which is not very flattering. He's at the mercy of his bodily functions. Again, what kind of a God is this who is limited by his own bodily functions, right? He has to use the restroom, right? He's too busy using the restroom to pay attention to you and answer your calling. He's taking a trip. Florida's nice this time of year. Maybe he's there. What that means, though, is if he's taking a trip, he's somewhere else, it means he's not here, which means he's finite and localized. He's limited by time and space. It means he's not omnipresent. And again, you look at the last one we talked about last week with the ark in Philistine territory. God is under the land. He's still able to work, right? He's not limited to just Israel. He's able to work in Philistia. He's able to work other places, right? Here, Baal, he's on a trip. He's somewhere else, scouting out some real estate somewhere else. He's not here to help you. And then lastly, he's sleeping, right? Being a god is, it's hard work. He's probably taking a nap. He needs to catch up on some sleep, right? Especially after he just lost an hour because of the time change. Right? He's feeling the effects. Right? What's even more ironic is this is supposed to be noon. It's the middle of the day, right? This isn't like the middle of the night. This is the middle of the day. And he's sleeping, so it's even more insulting that he's asleep at this time. But again, he gets tired. If he gets tired, that means he's not omnipotent, right? He's not all powerful if he gets worn out and has to recharge his batteries. And all of these things are things that they actually believe about Baal. These are not, he's insulting them with things that were actually part of their religious system. But in doing so, again, he's demonstrating the limitedness of this God that they think is worth worshiping. So again, he's pointing out that Baal has his limitations. Israel's God, right, which you'll see, is limitless, right? We believe in a God without limitations. But this Baal that they're worshiping basically suffers from the same limitations as his worshipers. He's not really any better, right? Baal's not really any better than the prophets who are serving him because he's stuck with the same limitations: time, space, bodily functions, needing for naps, right? What kind of a God do you really want to worship this God who isn't really any better than you are? Okay. And so he's basically saying that Baal's a poor excuse of God. Right? Even if he's obviously not going to be able to do anything anyway, but he's basically, this God is kind of a poor excuse for somebody to be worshiping. It's not really worth it. Now, what makes this even more humorous, and Elijah's mockery, that's one of my favorite parts. It's really funny. What makes this even more humorous is the prophets of Baal follow his advice. They do what he says, so they shout louder. Right? He says, shout louder. So that's what they do. Okay. That here you have the prophets of Baal. You should know how to worship their God, following the advice of the rival prophet in what they need to do to get their God's attention. Right? Which again is incredibly ironic. That they're doing what Elijah says. Right? So they work harder. And they engage in essentially self-mutilation, right? They hurt themselves in the hopes that this will get Baal's attention. Something which is forbidden in the Mosaic law, that this is strictly forbidden in the worship of the true God, that you would do this. You're not supposed to hurt yourself in the worship, but that's what the prophets of Baal do. So they spend all afternoon calling us to spend all morning. Now they spend all afternoon, and the result is more chirping crickets, right? More silence, more nada, right? No voice, no one answered, no one paid any attention, right? Here again, we get that threefold repetition, right? Of none and none and none, nothing, nothing, nothing. Again, this is sort of emphasizing the complete, total, absolute lack of anything in response. Absolutely no action whatsoever on the part of Baal. They spent all day working for this, and they've gotten absolutely nothing in response. Yeah, they got, yeah, they probably, yeah. probably need a blood transfusion afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, they're hurting. What's interesting, in a little aside, fast, quickly running out of time. In a little aside, there's this, what's fascinating is when it talks about in the first time, right? So when initially they start calling in the morning and they call it to Baal and they limp around, they a lot of times it's translated, they dance around the altar, but it's really actually the same word that Elijah uses earlier to say you're limping between these two gods, limping on crutches. That's essentially what the prophets of Baal are doing. It says, in essence, limping around their altar. And to me, this kind of, a little bit reflecting on what we talked about this morning with the idea of idolatry and the idols of our heart. This is the nature of idolatry, right? It cripples, right? That here the prophets of Baal, the best they can do in the worship of their God is just limp around. Right? That is, and then they engage in self-mutilation, right? In order for their God to pay attention, they have to hurt themselves. Hey, if I hurt myself, maybe Baal will see me. And so you have to wonder what again, in looking at that, what kind of a God, in order to get his attention, you have to hurt yourself to get his attention. What kind of God is that? What kind of God do you want to worship that requires that? You see this with other idolatry in the Old Testament, where they would engage in child sacrifice in order to worship their gods. Manasseh did that. A lot of the pagan peoples did that. You read about that in 2 Kings, where the king of Moab sacrificed his son in order to try to get the war against him to turn the tide. And this is the nature of idolatry, is that it leads to the destruction of God's image bearers. That is in some sense, the innate consequence of idolatry. That whenever we turn to idols, it leads to our destruction. It leads to the destruction of others. And we see that in our society today, in our worship of, we talked about that some this morning, the selfishness, what reveals our hearts. Our own society, in our worship of rights, our worship of equality and justice, that leads us to promote certain behaviors or encourage certain behaviors which are self-destructive. That in the obsession over women's rights, the willingness to kill our babies because we have to give women's rights. Right? Women have rights; they have equality. Right? That's absolutely true. They just don't have the right to kill their children, right? From our perspective. But in a culture that worships those rights, that sees those rights as preeminent, then there's this idolatry that devalues the image of God and leads to its, in some way, shape, or form, its destruction. And that's just what idolatry does. And that's part of why God is eager for us to walk after him, is because he knows, right? He doesn't just get angry with this because we've abandoned him. He's angry with this also because he knows that it leads to our destruction. We're his image bearers, and he doesn't want us doing what harms us. He knows that what's best for us is himself, right? And we pursue other gods, it only leads to our destruction. Right? And again, the reality is, when you pursue other gods, all you get is a whole bunch of nothing, just like the prophets of Baal. All right, very quickly, after the prophets of Baal, it's Elijah's turn. So again, he shows, by letting them go first, he shows the worthlessness of Baal. And so that will only heighten the contrast when God acts on his behalf, it will heighten all that much more the difference between the Lord and Baal, who was unable to do anything after a whole day's worth of asking. Right? So again, he brings the people over. He builds an altar to the Lord. He uses 12 stones, so he kind of symbolically represents all Israel in that, even though it's a divided kingdom. Still, all Israel is God's people. So he includes all of them in that process. He prepares the sacrifice, and then again, he douses it with water. And again, you get threefold repetition. The emphasis on this thing is really, really wet. Right? This is a really, really soggy altar that we've got here. And it emphasizes, in addition to kind of setting the odds against itself, it also emphasizes, again, if anything happens here, it's not by accident. It's not because, he sort of threw a spark without anybody noticing. I mean, if there's something happens, it's a true miracle, right? Again, he's made it absolutely clear that if God acts and this thing gets on fire, that's a supernatural action and demonstrates the power of God. Then he prays. There's some significance. He does this at the time of the evening sacrifice. So he's making his offering at the time when the offering was being made for the people of Israel. At the time of the evening sacrifice. Again, they had morning and evening sacrifices. So they're doing this at a time when there's already being a sacrifice being made for the people of Israel. And then you'll notice this contrast between what he does and the prophets of Baal, right? So the prophets of Baal, they're chanting all day long. He just gives one little prayer. In contrast to their prophetic ravings, he just has this very simple, heartfelt prayer in response. We have this again, he's just praying, right? No self-mutilation. He doesn't have to do any drastic measures to get God's attention. He just prays. And again, he's appealing to the Lord as Israel's true God. But there's a strong contrast between the prophets of Baal who do this all day long and get nothing, and Elijah, who just stands up, says a simple prayer, and boom, something happens. Right? So again, this strong contrast between these two gods and their messengers. Right, and so then we have a response, right? Unlike Baal, where you just get a whole bunch of nothing, Elijah prays, and you get this. Right? Maybe not quite that dramatic, but pretty close, right? You get basically a smoking crater, right? Because it burns up everything, not just the sacrifice, but the wood, the stones, the dirt, the water, everything's gone, right? So you kind of have something comes down and the smoke clears and it's just this big crater left behind, right? Because everything's got burned up. So again, in contrast to the silence that the prophets of Baal got, it was a very dramatic response on the part of the Lord. Right? The people should have no difficulty figuring out who's really God at this point. Right? It should be perfectly obvious. And so, right, their response is, probably what I would do in some situation, they fall on their faces, right? And they recognize that the Lord is God. I kind of feel like that they may have been a little bit like this, right? A little bit charred, at least the ones in the front rows. They might be a little bit sizzled by the event there. But they're feeling this. They're sold. They recognize that at the moment who the true God is. The moment they're sold on the reality of the Lord and inadequacy of Baal. And I've tried to present here in the translation what's actually in the Hebrew, that it's the God, right? Sometimes you'll see the word with and without the direct article. Thank you. The definite article. I always think direct object, but the definite article. Thank you. So it's the God, right? The Lord is the God. Earlier he says whether the Lord is the God or Baal is the God, right? He throws that direct article or the definite article in there to try to emphasize that the oneness. There's only one God there, right? So it's the God. Obviously, Baal is shown to be that he's not. Again, this is a winner-take-all competition. Prophets of Baal lost, and that wasn't so good for them, right? They get killed. And this is part of the Mosaic law, that the consequence for bringing false religion, either worshiping God incorrectly or bringing idolatry into Israel, was death. That was the penalty for that kind of action. And so, again, you're screwing, right? Bringing Baal into Israel, you're screwing with my people. There's a consequence for that. There's punishment for that. God doesn't take that lightly. And so there's a consequence for the prophets of Baal. So quickly to wrap up here, again, these ideas of the two camps. Again, those who oppose the Lord, those who take refuge in him. You got the prophets of Baal. They oppose the Lord, right? They're worshiping a whole other God. And yet their God proved to be impotent and worthless. Right? This other system that they tried to bring in is exposed to be nothing. Right? In this major showdown, right, where we chance for Baal to show himself, show he's real, failed miserably. Right? Their religious system is shown to be inept. Again, the idea of God laughing here, this whole passage, both Elijah and I see the author when he's writing this. I think the author just can't help but chuckling all the time he's writing this, because he weaves so much irony and humor into the whole story, right? That both Elijah and the biblical author, and therefore God, again, are making a mockery of the prophets of Baal, making a mockery of their God, which can't do anything, which isn't saying anything, no response, nothing, a whole bunch of silence. And in the end, like we talked about in Psalm 2, in the end, they perished. Again, they tried to take refuge in a false god. They tried to impose that on the people of Israel, and there was a consequence for that. Right? Again, we have humor. The humor in the story is at the expense of the prophets. Just like last week, the human story was at the expense of the Philistines. Before that, the humor was at the expense of Balaam and Balak. Right? That again, God laughing at these people who stand against him. If you stand against God, God will find humor at your expense, as opposed to our first story where God was laughing with Abraham and Sarah. Right? Those who take refuge in him, he laughs with. Those who oppose them, he laughs at. And again, we have a story where people oppose him, and God gets his humor at their expense. And so we have, in the contrast with the ineptness of Baal, we have the Lord demonstrating his own greatness. Again, by this humorous exposure of the worthlessness of Baal. Again, the contrast of that is just how great Israel's God really is. You see him working to draw his people back to himself, right? In Elijah's prayer, he actually uses past tense, that you have turned their hearts back to you again. That he works to reveal himself to his people. And again, there's this whole scene is to encourage his people, to challenge people to abandon the worship of the worthless gods and to turn and take refuge in him. Again, Psalm 2, take refuge in the true God. Those who take refuge in him will be blessed. One of the sad parts about this story is that this should have been it, right? They just see a smoking crater. It should be all over. Baal worship should be completely gone. It should be good times, big time religious awakening in Israel. And that's not what happens. Right? Baal worship continues. You have to get into 2 Kings and Jehu before Baal worship is really wiped out. It persists. It then goes down into Judah because of Ahab and Jezebel. Their daughter marries the son of Jehoshaphat, and it gets taken down into Judah for a while. It proliferates. It's there, right? It continues. And again, like we talked some about last week, unfortunately, it's the nature of the human heart. And again, we have a propensity towards idolatry, that even when we see magnificent things, we tend to have this hardness of heart and this propensity to follow the idols, because however destructive, however worthless, it just is the way our hearts go. The problem with being sinful creatures. So that's a challenge, right? In that, to us, talking about that in the service again today, being aware of our own idolatry? Can we see the idols in our own hearts? Can we see where our own hardness of heart and turn away from that? And that's not, unfortunately, as human beings, that's not always easy to do.